Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Nick Street. And you can see Nick's bio there. And at this time, Nick, I think we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Tiffany.
You're welcome.
So you can get a bit of information on me from my bio. So I'm not going to say too much about myself, but I'm going to advance to the first slide and just sort of tell you what's coming down the pike. So very broadly, there'll be three parts to what I'm going to tell you. First, just a very broad historical overview of sort of the origins and development of Buddhism as a religious movement. Then specifically, I'm going to focus on how Buddhism emerged as a religious tradition in the US and the sort of complex set of demographics around that bit of history. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about what I think some of the live issues in Buddhism are, specifically in the US, but also more broadly globally. So I'm I'm going to try to unpack these things as much as I can, but again, as Tiffany said, if you have questions for me along the way, just check in with Tiffany and I'll try to get to you at the end of the presentation. So, very broadly speaking, Buddhism as a religious movement began about 2,500 years ago. And there was a historical figure called the Shakyamuni Buddha, who was an ascetic. There's sort of several different ways of looking at him as a historical figure. On the one hand, he was an ascetic. He was a seeker, a contemplative. Another way of looking at him was a spiritual teacher, an expounder of the Dharma. And Dharma, in this case, means teaching or truth. And he was also, in a way, religious leaders often aren't, he was also very explicitly the founder of a movement. He was the founder of a large group of followers that were mainly renunciates like himself, but also lay people who were interested in this new form of teaching. To give you a sense of this historical context, Buddhism emerged in the Gangetic Plain. It's that sort of orange oval you can see in northern India, and subsequently spread to what eventually would become India, Pakistan, China, Southeast Asia. And there were a number of different sort of flavors or variations on sort of the Buddhist teaching, which we'll get into in just a minute. But at least at this point, it's enough to understand that at least for the first 1,000 years of the movement, it was largely an Asian movement rooted in the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and what would eventually become China. So to give you a sense for what this means, what the teaching actually was, what you'll see here is it's called the wheel of samsara, basically the wheel of rebirth. And this image, which many of you may have seen, was actually used as a teaching tool, specifically in Tibetan Buddhism, but it was also appropriated by Chinese and Japanese Buddhists as well. And the whole image, this sort of funky character with the skulls and the fangs and the long fingernails, is called Yama, the Lord of Death. And the wheel that he's holding actually represents the nature of human life. It's sort of a representation of both the individual human psyche and individual human societies. And I won't go into too much detail, but basically this whole device, this whole icon, is meant to act as a mirror to sort of show the viewer what reality basically is from a Buddhist perspective. So what you see at the hub are a snake, a pig, and a rooster representing greed, anger, and ignorance. And basically the whole apparatus of humans, unenlightened human society, so turns around those three energies like a wheel. And if you're curious about it, the wheel itself is divided into six different sections, which represent 6 different sort of modes of human interaction. And then the outer rim represents the sort of the mechanism of rebirth through karma. But that in itself is sort of serves to distinguish Buddhism from Vedic tradition, Hindu tradition, yogic tradition that came before it, in that unlike those traditions where karma is set by social caste or status of birth, basically individuals can actually affect their karma in a given lifetime. So this particular iconography is representative of that particular teaching or that particular reality. I'd be remiss if I'm telling you about, about Buddhism, not to talk briefly about the Four Noble Truths. This was sort of the basic teaching of the Buddha. As the story goes, he had his enlightenment experience at a place called Bodh Gaya, and realized he eventually needs to be able to communicate this to people. And basically, the Four Noble Truths are a riff on a classic South Asian diagnostic technique. And the technique is basically, well, tell me your problem. Well, let's help diagnose this. Tell me your problem. And the problem is basically, people suffer. They feel unfulfilled. They feel fearful of their own mortality. They feel generally sort of unhappy in their condition. And then the second part of this sort of diagnostic technique is, well, what's going on? What's actually the etiology of this ailment? And the Buddha's teaching, the second noble truth was, well, it's clinging. And you actually cling to the form of the body. You cling to mental forms. You cling to material objects. And the sort of significance of the teaching wasn't that you reject these things, but through the course of meditation, you actually sort of relax your grip on these things. And in that way, sort of start to get at the root of this clinging. And that's sort of the third of the sort of noble truths, the third sort of diagnostic technique is that, this isn't an indelible part of the human condition. There's actually something you can do about it. And then that brings you to the fourth noble truth, the sort of curative aspect of this diagnostic technique. And then, well, what do? You actually follow the Eightfold Path, which deals with contemplation, ethical behavior, and sort of interpersonal wisdom. So now back from phenomenology to history. So over the course of the first 1,500 years of Buddhist history, eventually this broad movement in East and Southeast Asia differentiated itself into three sort of smaller movements. The oldest of these is Theravada Buddhism. It's in red on this map. You can see that it basically sort of dominates cultures in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Sri Lanka. Then there's Tibetan Buddhism, which geographically is the largest of the three sort of historical traditions or historical movements or historical vehicles, they're called in the Buddhist tradition. But so numerically, it's actually quite small, because if you look at the map, you'll realize that those orange areas are actually very sparsely populated. Then the largest of the three vehicles or movements or traditions is Mahayana, the great vehicle. And that took root in China and Japan and gave rise to the Pure Land traditions, Nichiren Buddhism in Japan, and Chan, and then Zen. Chan is the Chinese precursor to Zen Buddhism in Japan. Now we're going to get to the US. What does all this have to do with us? So historically, at least prior to, I would argue, the 1970s, 1980s, there were three main sort of modes or three main strands of Buddhism in the US. There was immigrant Buddhism. You can see here, the Chinese rail workers in California in the 1800s. And it was, the immigrant Buddhists were largely Chinese workers in sort of Northern California and sort of in the mountainous American West working on the railroads, and sort of agrarian immigrants, largely Japanese immigrants in Southern California. They're export Buddhists, which is actually the smallest of these three cohorts. And that would be almost like Buddhist evangelicalism in a way. Those movements basically came out of Japan up until the latter part of the 20th century. And these three characters are figures in Soka Gakkai Buddhism, which is a form of Pure Land Buddhism that emerged in Japan right around the time of World War II. And then finally, there's import or convert Buddhism. And that was basically Buddhism of sort of elite white, largely white intellectuals who had the wherewithal, sort of financial and otherwise, to travel to Buddhist culturally dominated parts of Asia, study with gurus and other masters, and actually bring back to the US syncretic forms of Buddhism. The two characters you see in this picture are Madame Blavatsky and Henry Olcott, who founded the Theosophical Society in the US. And Theosophical Society is going to be important to remember because it eventually gives rise to the Beat movement and other sort of latter-day import and convert Buddhist phenomena in the U.S. So all this brings us to World War II. And most of us know that when the U.S. was fighting sort of a two-front war, German Americans ended up not being treated nearly as harshly as Japanese Americans during the Second World War. And that had to do in large part with racist and ethnic bias against people who most Americans at the time saw as sort of an ethnic or cultural other. But it also had to do with the sort of exoticizing effect that bias in the American psyche viewed Buddhism, the lens through which most Americans tended to view Buddhism. And this particular image sort of embodies that sort of trend toward exoticization among most Americans during World War II. And you might notice sort of in the lower right-hand corner, this is Dr. Seuss. This is the guy who wrote all of our sweet children's books, who was actually an anti-Japanese propagandist in Southern California during the Second World War. And it's interesting because that changed dramatically after the end of the Second World War. For example, if you look at coverage of Buddhists and Buddhism in the LA Times immediately before and immediately after the war, editorially, the LA Times was completely in support of internment camps for Japanese citizens and actually was sort of virulently Japanophobic during the course of the Second World War. Two things happened immediately following the end of the Second World War. First, images of internment camps arrived in the American press from Europe, and it was very unsettling to realize that even if the internment camps in the U.S. had not been as murderously violent as the internment camps in Germany, nonetheless, there were people in prison garb behind barbed wire who had been rounded up basically because of their ethnicity. So that was the first sort of cultural shock that occasioned a dramatic shift in American news media coverage of primarily immigrant Buddhism. The second thing that happened, and this is specific to Southern California, is that the 442nd Infantry Division, which was basically a largely Nisei, largely sort of second generation Japanese American infantry division that was deployed in Europe, was one of the most decorated infantry divisions of the war. There's actually a monument to the 442nd in a cemetery east of downtown LA. And it's remarkable to see the shift in coverage in the LA Times just over the course of 2 or 3 years. I mean, it went from virulently anti-Buddhist, anti-Japanese right before the end of the war to lauding the 442nd and then Japanese Americans more broadly immediately after the war. And so between the end of the Second World War and I would say like the 70s or 80s, these three main strands, sort of import Buddhism, immigrant Buddhism, and export Buddhism, were still basically the three main strands, but there were a number of other interesting cultural phenomenon that sort of bear examination. In the upper left-hand corner, you see a very famous picture of the immolation of a Vietnamese Zen monk named Quang Duc. This is sort of in the thick of the Vietnam War, and the U.S. was supporting the South Vietnamese government, which was basically dominated by Catholic Vietnamese converts, sort of Catholic Vietnamese elites. And the sort of majority Buddhist population felt disenfranchised by this sort of elite government supported by the US. There were a series of riots to protest various ways that the South Vietnamese government was discriminating against the Buddhist majority population, but most of those protests went largely ignored by the U.S. government that was backing the South Vietnamese. So this was a dramatic act that had never happened before. This monk sort of sat himself down at a busy intersection in Saigon and set himself aflame. And from my perspective, it completely changed, if not the war itself, then the way that the U.S. media was covering the war. There was a great New York Times reporter named David Halberstam, who was in Vietnam at this time and did fabulous investigative reporting on Quang Duc and the discontent that had given rise to this act. And it really represented a shift in the sort of condescending exoticization of sort of ethnic others from the US perspective who practiced this exotic religion, to understanding Buddhists, regardless of whether they were American citizens or Buddhists abroad, as people who had the same kind of agency, people who had the same kind of concerns that Americans themselves had. It really was an important shift in the way American news media covered Buddhism. Also around the same time, sort of mid-20th century, post-war, there's this sort of syncretic trend, specifically around Zen or Mahayana Buddhism. It becomes incorporated into sort of countercultural movements like the Beats. You can see one of Alan Watts' best-known books on the upper right. Also in the sort of post-war years, the Dalai Lama first came to public prominence in the US and began the media juggernaut that continues to this day. And also, sort of arguably, one of the most important things to happen relative to Buddhism in the US in the post-war years was the Immigration Act of 1965. In this chart that I pulled up, you can see that after 1965, immigration specifically from Asia, specifically from what were then Buddhist majority countries, explodes in the US. So you see this proliferation specifically of immigrant forms of Buddhism, largely in the American West, but also in sort of particularly diverse, particularly sort of immigrant-rich cities in the East as well. So now we get to the 1970s, 1980s, and it's at this time, I would argue, that a new, very distinctly American form of Buddhism, although it's not called Buddhism by most people who practice it, began to emerge from the medical profession. It basically medicalized Buddhist meditation or mindfulness. And this particular trend, this particular phenomenon began to emerge specifically in the late 1980s through a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who was a physician at the Massachusetts Medical Center, part of the University of Massachusetts system. And Kabat-Zinn had developed, he himself had studied in the Vipassana tradition. Vipassana is largely a lay-oriented or lay-focused movement within Theravadan Buddhism. And a number of well-known Buddhist figures in the US, Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, Diana Winston at UCLA, trained very formally in this quite traditional form of Buddhist meditation, but then brought what they had learned back to the US after training in Southeast Asia and began to develop these meditation techniques that, as you can see in this picture, are largely stripped of Buddhist iconography, any sort of religious iconography, and in sort of scrubbed of even religious language as well. And concurrently with this, sort of again, starting in the 70s and heading into the 80s, a sort of parallel phenomenon, the rise of the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S. That is to say, people who tick none of the above on religious identification surveys. Currently, about, in a way, none of the above is the largest American religious cohort these days. It's about 25% of the adult population, and among young adults, about a third of the young adult population ticks none of the above on religious identification surveys. The important thing to understand, generally speaking, but specifically for this presentation, is that none of the above doesn't necessarily mean atheistic or agnostic. It generally means, in the American context, spiritual but not religious, nothing in particular, I'm kind of a seeker, I believe in sort of a higher power or supernatural, but institutional religion really isn't for me. So this demographic trend has developed concurrently with the trend toward a medicalized form of Buddhism that's sort of stripped of institutional iconography. What this has meant in consequence is that there's been a proliferation of programs similar to the one that John Kabat-Zinn began to develop in Massachusetts in the late 70s and early 80s. Here in Southern California, one of the big centers for this is the medical school at UCLA, which has developed MARC, the Mindful Awareness Research Center. You see an image of MARC here. The woman on the right is Diana Winston, who's the key teacher at UCLA's MARC. She herself studied in Southeast Asia in a very traditional Theravadan Buddhist setting, but has been instrumental in developing this sort of new form, this sort of secularized form of mindfulness meditation in the US. And this seems like a a really sort of boring chart. I mean, this basically is the kind of chart that's used to justify programs like MARC, or to justify mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques as they're applied, for example, to soldiers returning from war with PTSD, adults and young adults with ADHD. All of these sort of applications of this medicalized form of mindfulness meditation are justified by data such as you see here. But the real significance of this for our purposes isn't, parsing the data. It's more that scientific data itself in this new tradition, this is why I argue it's a new tradition, has come to replace sort of spiritual lineage or teaching lineage as a marker of authenticity. And that's something that, it seems kind of eggheady and kind of difficult to understand, but I think it's very, very important. Specifically, if you're looking at sort of the religious practices of young adults who are spiritual but not religious, who fall into this category of none of the above, because if you talk to them, this is what I do. This is what we do in my shop. We basically interview lots of different religious communities, but specifically young adults. And this sort of concern for authenticity is very important among this particular cohort, but authenticity isn't configured usually as sort of a teaching lineage or traditional Buddhist lineage. It's more concerned with sort of personal experience, sort of somatic experience, and also for, is there scientific evidence that this is actually beneficial? So it's a fascinating thing for me, and I'll get into in just a minute the sort of news angle on this, the sort of practical consequences of it. And this is just sort of an interesting side note. The actual neurophysiology of mindfulness. I've got this very simple diagram that you can see. Basically, the amygdala, the sort of evolutionarily primitive part of the brain, is responsible for the fight or flight response. Basically, reactions to events that are triggering anger or fear tend to activate the amygdala first, instead of the sort of larger, more evolutionarily sophisticated parts of the brain. When you begin to develop mindfulness techniques, regardless of whether you're doing traditional Zen meditation, which is what I do, or if you're doing one of these sort of religiously scrubbed, medicalized mindfulness techniques, you're activating the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, a more evolutionarily sophisticated part of the brain that has to do with attention and awareness. And the fascinating thing from my perspective is this sort of neurophysiological explanation of what's going on with mindfulness actually has this fabulous historical analog in the image of the bodhisattva of compassion, the sort of manifestation of compassionate wisdom, sort of riding a dragon. And that actually is an excellent mirror of what's happening in the mind of a meditator. You're literally, through the process of cultivating attention and awareness, creating a feedback loop that sort of calms the dragon, calms this sort of quote unquote reptilian part of the brain. So that I give you that for free. That's just something that I kind of like about all of this stuff. So what am I looking at now? What do I see on the landscape? Especially for those of you who are in the RNA cohort, those of you who are journalists, these are the things that I find most interesting related to Buddhism on the American scene and then sort of worldwide. In the upper left, you see a guy named Noah Levine, who's the founder of Against the Stream, which is sort of punk-oriented DIY Buddhist community based in LA, but actually with sort of chapters largely in California, but also in other parts of the US. The thing that's interesting to me about Noah Levine is that both he and his father trained formally in a Theravadan lineage, so Southeast Asian Buddhist lineage, but each of them has struck off on his own, and Noah Levine now has this sort of overtly atheistic, very sort of punk. You see he has lots of tattoos. When I've gone to Against the Stream, I don't have any tattoos. I always feel kind of naked when I go to Against the Stream. But the phenomenon that Noah represents is one that has sort of concerned other people like Diana Winston at MARC at UCLA, because if you're steering away from this more traditional notion of lineage or authenticity, how then do you gauge who is an authentic sort of spiritual teacher or mindfulness instructor. So the sort of mechanisms by which you need to replace the sort of older, more traditional, more institutional forms of authenticity and lineage is sort of up in flux. It's actually a cause for concern among a lot of sort of surveyors of the Buddhist scene, specifically in California, but largely in the US. Two stories from abroad that are kind of fascinating. There's sort of Buddhist revival movements, both in China and India. I mean, they're happening for very different reasons. The Chinese revival movement, and this is it's more complicated than this, but this is sort of my broad view of it. In a way, it's largely motivated for economic reasons. The Buddhist revival pilgrimage sites are often in poorer parts of China, away from the coastal cities, and it's sort of they're characters who I call stunt monks, basically sort of people who are dressed up in monks' outfits to sort of lend an air of authenticity for the tourists who are coming to these pilgrimage sites. In India, the situation is very different. There's actually a Buddhist revival movement among the Dalits, the sort of traditional untouchable caste in the Hindu system. And this goes back all the way to the founding of the modern state of India. Ambedkar, the guy who wrote the Indian Constitution, was himself a Dalit convert to Buddhism. So there's this sort of revival of like the deep notions of karma, the deep notions of personal agency involved in the sort of Dalit convert Buddhist movements in India, which is very fascinating. There's Buddhist nationalism, which has received a lot of press in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand. The guy on the cover of Time is Anshin Raratu, who's the monk who's led the 969 movement in Burma against the Rohingya Muslim minority. Odious guy, but there are a number of movements like that that are developing in traditional Theravadan Buddhist parts of the world. The sort of last thing that I'll also toss out to you, which is kind of fascinating, there's been this sort of corporatization of medicalized mindfulness. Google now has its own mindfulness guru. Where I teach, the University of Southern California has this sort of mindful USC movement. And other sort of quote unquote elite universities, sort of Yale specifically is coming to mind, have these sort of corporatized mindfulness movements that ironically are intended to increase productivity. And it's just sort of ironic to my mind that this movement that started, with this raggedy ass little ascetic guy in the Gangetic Plain 2,500 years ago is now sort of giving rise to this completely spiritually scrubbed sort of corporatized form of mindfulness meditation. So I think that's about it for, perfect. That's about it for me. So if you guys have any questions for me, I'd be happy to talk to you.
All right, everyone, go ahead and post your questions into the chat box. Nick, one thing that struck me as you were talking and you were showing about the internment camps, I wondered what your thoughts have been in the current climate in the United States and the political scene, and how those same echoes are being heard perhaps among other faith traditions right now.
Yeah, well, it is interesting. I mean, I've done some reporting on, the sort of cheeky title of the reporting project that I've been working on, both for the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and for my own shop, the Center for Religion and Civic Culture, is called, quote unquote, the other Muslim fringe. And the basic idea is that, demographically, everyone knows that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram are proportionally tiny parts of the sort of global Muslim movement, Islamic movement. And the same holds true in the US. And it's been interesting for me. I mean, I'm a gay man, so Orlando has been both sort of heart-wrenching and fascinating for me to watch. But it's been interesting to see after Orlando how this sort of, stinky, atavistic impulse in the American psyche is emerging again, with sort of calls for barring Muslim immigration to the U.S. and also not just dramatically increasing surveillance of Muslim communities, but actually encouraging Muslims to rat out one another. I think, and I don't want to get too political on this, but the sort of presumptive Republican presidential nominee has asked for Muslims. He said something like, Muslims know who in their communities are the bad guys, and they should turn them in. I mean, it's really, and it's not unique to the U.S. I mean, this kind of tribal impulse, the scapegoating impulse. I mean, this goes back to the Wheel of Samsara. That's sort of first image that I had up about sort of the Buddhist perspective on the human psyche. This is very, very ancient, very old stuff, and we have our own version of it. But it's important, from my perspective, it's important always to, and again, this is sort of a consequence of my own sort of Zen training or Buddhist training, to sort of, learn to watch your own mind. I mean, if your fear is being provoked, if your anger is being triggered, I think it's always important to ask, so has sort of the person who is being pointed at as the vector for my discontent, is that the person who's triggering my anger, or is it the demagogue who's pointing the finger? So I don't know. I'm just very, very wary of all of that sort of thing, both from sort of a personal perspective and also from a historical perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. With good reason as well. Mm. I do have a host of questions here that have come in. I'm going to go ahead and read them in the order that they were written. Okay. First, has anything changed in Myanmar since Suu Kyi took power?
Yes and no. I mean, I've been very frustrated with her and frustrated with the party of which she is the head. I mean, I'm not unique in this. Lots of people have written about this. To my mind, now that she has sort of surmounted the difficulties posed by the former junta and has actually seen the political party that she represents assume a larger measure of power, a sort of full-throated condemnation of the Rohingya minority, the sort of Muslim minority in northwestern Burma, seems in order to my mind, but that hasn't been forthcoming. And I mean, a lot of sort of American Buddhist apologists see in her reticence sort of the constraints on her power. I mean, even though the junta has ceded some power to civilian government, the military is still very powerful. And the sort of traditional monastic elites in Myanmar are still very powerful. I get that, but I don't find it persuasive. So I'm hoping that as sort of pressure both from within and from abroad increases on Aung San Suu Kyi and the government that she represents, that so discrimination against the Rohingya minority will be addressed. I don't know that that's going to happen until there's really concerted pressure on her and the government she represents to change. But I don't see it happening anytime soon. And, from my perspective, and this is for those of you who are journalists as well as religious communicators, one of the great sort of commissions of journalism from my perspective is, raking the muck, actually sort of shining a light on places where nasty things are going on, but for whatever reason, we look elsewhere, or attention is drawn elsewhere. So, I would commend those of you who are concerned about this issue, specifically those of you who are journalists and concerned about this issue. Keep talking about it, keep covering it, because nothing is going to change until the spotlight is sort of trained steadily on that particular part of the world.
Okay. The next question says, could you speak a bit about the relationship right now in the United States between immigrant and convert Buddhist communities?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Immigrant Buddhist communities are largely in a sort of demographic steady state or slowly declining. For example, there's an institution called Zen Shuji here in Los Angeles, which is basically the headquarters temple of the Soto Buddhist. Soto is a sect of Japanese Buddhism. The Soto Buddhist headquarters for North America. And back in the day, in the 60s and 70s, it was a very vital place. It was basically sort of the seedbed for what eventually would become both immigrant and convert Buddhist communities in the U.S. But over the past couple of decades, as interest in institutions generally has diminished, and specifically among second and subsequent generation immigrant immigrant demographics or immigrant generations. Zen Shuji, and I'm giving you this as an example, Zen Shuji is a shadow of its former self. They used to have 200 people on a weekend for a service, and now they're lucky if they get a handful for a service that's held once a month. It's interesting because Zen Shuji has tried to revitalize itself by attracting import Buddhists or convert Buddhists. So if you go to Zen Shuji, there's sort of an upper hall that looks like a sort of traditional Japanese or traditional Chinese temple with sort of a beautiful altar at which services are performed, and then an area for lay people to pray or to meditate or to engage in the service. But in the sort of basement area, the lower area of Zen Shuji, there's a tiny room that actually looks like a traditional, Chinese or Japanese meditation hall specifically for monks, 1,000 years ago. And the irony is the majority of the people who go to the services upstairs at Zen Shuji are sort of graying first generation Japanese immigrants. And the majority of people who go to the more monastic setting in the lower part of Zen Shuji are sort of, white converts like myself. So there's this interesting demographic shift, this sort of interesting tension between immigrant and convert Buddhists, specifically in California, but more broadly in the US. I mean, I think, I'm sure many of you know, I mean, basically from the presentation, you can intuit that sort of getting an actual count of convert or non quote unquote ethnic or immigrant Buddhist communities would be very difficult, because a lot of people who engage, even if they engage on a daily basis in mindfulness practice, may not consider themselves Buddhist at all. They might not consider themselves religious in any way. They see what they do as part of sort of a personal health routine or wellness routine. An example of this, one of the groups that I've been profiling here in Southern California is Sunday Assembly. Sunday Assembly is basically godless church. I mean, it started in the UK a few years back and has spread very rapidly in parts of the world, and specifically parts of the US where that sort of religiously unaffiliated demographic is growing very rapidly, like places in California. And I was interviewing this fantastic young woman who goes to Sunday Assembly and considers herself not a hardcore atheist, but basically a non-believer. And she sought out Sunday Assembly because she wanted community. So I'm at her apartment and I'm interviewing her, and she has her phone on a table in front of her. And she's sort of telling me how she grew up Catholic in Texas and then realized she doesn't believe and moved to California and now goes to Sunday Assembly. And sort of in the middle of her spiel, her phone emits this very spiritual, very pious, sort of deep, long tone. It's like a temple bell almost. And the conversation stops. And I look at her and she looks at me and I say, "Is that a meditation bell?" And she laughs and says, and this is such a great quote, she says, "I can go for the woo, I just can't go for the woo-woo." So basically what that means from my perspective is there's a large number of people, specifically sort of young people, who have left all institutional forms of religion, but are still looking for some sort of practice that they may or may not call spiritual, but is usually one of the forms of mindfulness developed out of a place like Mark at UCLA, or a place like, for example, Spirit Rock in Northern California. So in some ways, to get back to come full circle, the immigrant Buddhist communities are sort of holding their own or declining. The same is basically every institutional form of religious practice in the US, the Catholic Church, mainline Protestant churches, synagogues, mosques, basically are peopled by, in some ways, either older people who have grown up in a tradition, or fairly recent immigrants who are sort of peopling the institutions that sort of mirror the institutions in the places that they've come from. But I have a feeling most of those traditional institutions, like traditional institutions in American Christianity, are going to begin declining. And I think that the number of quote unquote convert Buddhists or mindfulness practitioners will continue to grow, but be very difficult to categorize because, again, they don't particularly associate themselves with any specific institution.
Okay, thank you. The next question says, what do journalists tend to get wrong when covering Buddhism in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, the broad question is, I think, and I realize I'm speaking to the hometown crowd, but I think often journalists get everything wrong about every religion. I mean, I see this specifically in coverage of Islam, because the sort of representation of the tradition in headlines and in most stories doesn't represent sort of the mainstream of the tradition. It represents sort of, from my perspective, the sort of right-wing fringe. But looking specifically at Buddhism, what that means is that first, and actually I don't want to be all negative about this, so let me sort of flip it on its head and sort of make some sort of positive statements, and that will hopefully encourage you. One of the first important things to realize about Buddhism or any other religious tradition is that it's a movement. Like, there is, in a very practical phenomenological sense, literally there is no such thing as Buddhism. There is no such thing as Islam. If you think that there is, show it to me. Basically, what there is are Buddhists or Muslims or Rastafarians or what have you. There are people who practice a set of certain rituals, who engage in a certain set of beliefs, and define themselves by virtue of those practices or beliefs as Buddhists or Muslims or Rastafarians or what have you. So the first thing to understand about reporting on Buddhism or any other religious tradition is that it's a movement. It's organic. It's something that people do. Sociologists tend to describe religions as phenomenon that allow people to shape identity, create meaning, and form community. And I think those are three very important things to keep in the back of your minds, both as religious communicators and as journalists. So when you begin to report on Buddhism in the US or anywhere else or any other religious tradition, so keep in the back of your mind, like, whatever your source, whatever your interlocutor is saying, is basically telling you something about how they and their immediate community tend to organize themselves, create meaning, and shape identity within the context of that particular group, regardless of whether it's Buddhist or Muslim or whatever. So first and foremost, I would say sort of realize that what you're looking at is a human movement and is organic and sort of change and shifts over time. Then sort of specific to Buddhism, I mean, I'll go back to this issue, and I hear this all the time from people who I talk to through my work here at USC. There's this issue of authenticity. I mean, people are looking for authentic spiritual lineage. People are looking for an authentic experience, something that feels authentic to them. And then they're looking for authenticity, as I said earlier, as sort of a marker of scientific authenticity, a mark of scientific seal of approval, that kind of thing. So it's important to know when you're talking to someone who either considers him or herself a Buddhist, or who engages in a practice that in the back of your mind you're thinking of as one of these sort of medicalized forms of Buddhist meditation, to sort of really get at, what does this person mean by authenticity? Are they talking about an embodied experience? Are they talking about a historical lineage? Really, what's meant by this notion of authenticity? And then finally, I mean, you've got the sort of sociological perspective. You've got the question of authenticity. Finally, the question is authority. Like, by what authority is this marker of authenticity deemed authentic? Is it sort of, by virtue of the medical school at UCLA? Is it by virtue of, a teacher in a Zen lineage saying that this is an authentic representation of the teaching that has been transmitted to me through my lineage? These are sort of three main things to keep in mind: sort of authority, authenticity, and then the sort of phenomenology of religion as a movement. I hope that helps.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Next
good.
question is, how do leaders of traditional Buddhism in Asia view these new, uniquely American manifestations of Buddhism? Do they lament the scrubbing of its spiritual or theological element by largely white converts?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in some ways, In some ways, and I mean, I'm getting a little out of my depth because I haven't done a lot of reporting on monastic communities, for example, in Southeast Asia, but just sort of my secondhand information, my secondhand response to that question is, I mean, it's a mixed bag. Like so much else, it's a mixed bag. I mean, on the one hand, the medicalized forms of mindfulness taught at UCLA and other both sort of semi-spiritual institutions and then sort of academic institutions in the US has prompted a lot of people to be curious about the origins of the techniques that they're being taught. And in consequence, I think there's still a fair amount of spiritual pilgrimage. I think there's still a fair number of Americans who are curious about the Chinese origins of Zen, for example, or the, Southeast Asian origins of Vipassana. And there's actually a number of these sort of, white appropriators. There's a guy named Matthew Brensilver who is sort of to my mind, and actually any of you who want to report on him, he'd be a great character for a profile. His name is Matthew Brensilver. Because he really sits at the intersection of a number of different strands. He's been involved in Against the Stream. He himself has trained in classical Vipassana meditation, sort of Theravadan, Southeast Asian style meditation. But he's also involved both in Mark at UCLA and Spirit Rock in Northern California. And through him, I've actually heard that both a lot of the teachers who have trained in these traditional techniques themselves are lamenting the fact that there's something that's been lost. There's some sort of deeper spiritual development or possibility that's lost when you scrub these techniques, when you scrub these particular mindfulness movements of the sort of religious origins that sort of characterize them as religious practices. On the other hand, from my perspective, and I actually heard this from a former Tibetan monk, guy named Lobsang Rapgay, who actually was an interpreter for the Dalai Lama and then came to the US and got an MD, meaning a traditional Western medical degree, and is now, he's sort of like the secret brain trust of Mark. He has this little office in the basement of the UCLA Medical Center and basically produces charts like the ones that I showed you. And from his perspective, because I asked him a similar question years ago, what's been lost in this sort of largely white appropriation of largely sort of brown originated meditation techniques, and he also said that from his perspective as a traditional Tibetan Buddhist, anything that reduces suffering is actually an authentic expression of the Buddhist teaching. So even if you're, teaching one of these medicalized mindfulness techniques to a vet with PTSD, and this is quite common. There are actually, grants from the National Institutes of Mental Health to study mindfulness techniques as a palliative measure for vets with PTSD. If you're actually teaching a vet who, and pardon my very technical language, who's been fucked up by horrific experiences in whatever front he or she is returning from, and by teaching them to do that, create that feedback loop, so create the sort of feedback loop between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and thereby you allow them to relate to their difficult emotional states in a different way. Even if that vet is an evangelical Christian, and for that reason, you have given them this technique in a very religiously scrubbed kind of way, you have helped them reduce their suffering. And from my perspective, and also from the perspective of this sort of former Tibetan Buddhist monk who's now an MD working at UCLA, you have actually sort of connected what you're doing to the authentic lineage of the Buddha as a teacher, even if there's no sort of woo-woo, even if there's no sort of mumbo-jumbo attached to the technique. So all that to say, I'm sorry, this is like, it's complicated. It's very complicated. And, from my perspective, that makes all of this, very rich territory to mind as a journalist, because, if you're a journalist, you always need to look for the tension. You need to look for the tension in a story. And, which reminds me, I think one of the poverties of American coverage of Buddhism, just generally speaking, is this notion, unless you're covering Ancient Waratu in Burma, there's often this sort of gauzy, soft-focused lens through which American journalists look at Buddhism, and in a way that's very unfair. I mean, in the chapter I wrote on American press coverage of Buddhism, I call that phenomenon horns to halos. It's like we went from Buddhists, especially immigrant Buddhists, being these scary devil characters before World War II, and then after World War II, coverage almost overcompensated. It's like people are unwilling to sort of find the complexity, find the tension in stories related to Buddhism, and in a very rich way, it's there. So anyway, that's a kind of a long-winded answer to a good question. I hope that my response has helped.
Yeah. So this next question takes one angle of that. Do the spiritual seekers who may work meditation into their create your own adventure religious routine, do they ever make a formal commitment to Buddhism? This person is wondering if a growing love of meditation will lead to more Buddhist converts. Well,
it's an interesting question. I mean, the short answer I would say is no, because I mean when I showed the graph about the sort of religious nuns in ONES, that trend is increasing. I mean, there is no sign that disenchantment. And I use that in the Weberian sociological sense. This sort of disenchantment with religious institutions, I think, is going to continue for, I would say, at least another generation. I mean, I think millennials now are sort of at the crest, sort of at the apex of this disaffiliation trend, but I think it will continue. I mean, whatever the hell we call the generation after the millennials, I think it's going to continue with that generation as well. I think 10 and certainly 20 years from now, the story will probably be different. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, for example, another area that I've been doing some reporting is South Korea. And if you just look at a very basic pie chart of Southern California versus Seoul, for example, 50% of the general population in Southern California considers itself, none of the above. Same for South Korea. The difference is that 50% cohort in Southern California is composed mainly of people who are kind of like the woman from Sunday Assembly. She's spiritually curious, but she's not interested in any sort of institutional form of religion. In South Korea, by contrast, that 50% is largely atheistic. I mean, South Korean young people tend to be very materialistic. They're very pre-professional. In South Korea, I mean, the situation is different here in Southern California, where the Korean immigrant population is largely Christian. But already, I mean, there's a sociologist of religion who teaches at a Jesuit university in Seoul. His name is Seil, Seiloh. And he's been studying religious disaffiliation in South Korea and the US for 2 decades now. And he's already beginning to see among very young South Koreans, sort of teens and early 20s, this sort of sense of sort of poverty, this sort of, dare we say, dukkha, this sort of sense of unfulfillment or suffering. And it hasn't amounted to much so far. I mean, these young people are not returning to traditional religious institutions. But the thing that I'm seeing here in Southern California is that members of the sort of millennial cohort who fall into this sort of, none of the above trend are seeking different modes of creating community, generating meaning, and shaping identity that exist outside of traditional religious institutions. So the sort of short answer to that question is, I think in the near term, the young people specifically, and sort of spiritual, not religious seekers more generally, who are learning these meditation techniques probably aren't going to be joining a temple, or they may be sort of seeking out groups like Against the Stream that sort of in their punk ethos tend to cast themselves as non-institutional institutions. But I think you're going to see sort of a rebound of interest in more organized forms of religious practice not among the millennials, but among the next generation. But the thing that's interesting to me is I don't think that means they're going to be returning to Zen temples or, Catholic churches or mosques or synagogues. I think they're going to be creating institutions of their own. I think this period of religious flux that the U.S. is going through is fascinating for a number of reasons. And one of them is I think there are going to be new movements, new sort of future institutions that are spawned out of the flux.
Okay. We have just a little bit of time left, so I have one final question.
Sure.
And this person wants you to please address the leadership structures and basic titles one should know when writing about Buddhism.
Holy smokes.
Perhaps we'll focus that on more specific to U.S.
Sure. Well, it varies. I mean, it depends on, whether you're talking about sort of immigrant Buddhism, like if you're talking about, for example, Tibetan Buddhism, more often than not, the teacher is called Rinpoche, for example. Or if you're talking about the tradition that I practice in Zen Buddhism, the teacher is usually called Roshi. And it's interesting. Like that's another sort of outcome of one of the projects that my Center for Religion and Civic Culture has undertaken. Basically, we've created this PDF to help for example, female workers understand how to interact with religious communities. And there are no hard and fast rules. I mean, especially because we're in this period of flux, how you address teachers or spiritual elders in a given community can vary even within traditions. For example, if you go to Kadampa Meditation Center, which is a Tibetan new religious movement, or if you go to a Shambhala Center, which is also a Tibetan religious movement, I mean, you're probably not going to be calling the teacher Rinpoche. You're going to be calling them him or her something distinct to that particular community. So this is kind of a lame way of answering the question. That should be one of the first questions you ask when you start to cover any given religious community, Buddhist or otherwise, is, how should I address you? Or please help me understand the proper way to interact. Because as I said, I mean, religions are movements and they change over time, and they can change over a very short period of time. So, I mean, if you want to depend on Google or Wikipedia for just entree into a given religious community, that's fine. I mean, I think the information is usually trustworthy, depending on the source. But I would really make that one of the first things that you suss out when you begin to cover a religious community that you're not familiar with is how do these sort of things that can look fairly routinized, fairly regular from 25,000 feet, i.e. from a Google page, how do those things play out on the ground? And more often than not, they're nuanced in a way that you can only sort out by asking a direct question. So, I mean, it's kind of a lame answer, ask the question, but I don't know. I think that's the safest bet.
Perhaps an honest one. So
yeah, exactly.
There's something to that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Nick, thank you so much. We are so grateful to the USC Center for Religion and Civic Culture for lending us your time today. Your unique perspective as a journalist and Zen Buddhist priest was, really an exceptional experience for our participants. And we're grateful to you for sharing your wisdom with us. I will be sure to share Nick's presentation in the Basecamp project when it becomes available. But at this time, we'll say goodbye for today. So thank you again, everyone, for your time. And I'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, all.